The next story is one of those that really give a temperature check and a dipstick into just how sick our society is. Researchers have uncovered shocking levels of abuse and sexual harassment of domestic workers at the hands of employers. They found that workers hardly ever report these incidents. COVID-19 is said to have worsened the situation. For more on this, we are joined by Bongiwe Ndondo from one of the organizations which carried out the study, the Hlanganisa Institute of Development, Southern Africa. She talks to me now from Centurion. And Bongiwe, thank you for joining me. And I think I want to, it's important for us to own up to the mess and the situation that women who work as domestic workers are subjected to. Let's start with the forms of abuse that you came across in the study that you did.
So I think the first thing to note, Thulasizwe, is where you've started, to recognize the alarming levels of gender-based violence in South Africa. And having recognized that, to also make a note that certain groups are disproportionately affected by gender-based violence, and domestic workers are one such group. So as an organization, we are interested in making sure that people who live on the margins, that their voices are heard and that their issues are also put to the fore. So this is the context in which Hlanganisa partnered with Izwi Domestic Worker movement to make sure that the voices of ordinary women working in our homes are actually amplified. And what we found was that domestic workers work in isolation. They work in your home, Thulas, in mine, in people's private homes and in people's very intimate spaces. And they often have very vague job descriptions, that lend them very easily to sexual violence and sexual harassment within their workplaces. And remember, by workplace here, we're talking about somebody's home. So where in your ordinary workplace, you would typically have a human resource department. This is not what you have for domestic workers. So any employee in distress is forced to, confront their boss. I'm going to use the boss because that was the term used in the report, but forced to confront their employer. And what the report showed was that often the employers are the main perpetrators of sexual violence and exploitations within this group. And domestic workers have very little by way of recourse. And many of them do not take the bold step to report the violence because they risk losing their jobs. So they're caught between a rock and a hard place, really. And for those that do, they are often victimized by law enforcement agents, and many of the domestic workers we spoke to, by far the greatest percentage were undocumented migrants. Sure. And so again, they are fearful that they are going to be subjected to further forms of discrimination if they do report. And you asked the question to us, what were some of the, forms of violence? Yeah. So for instance, you had, employers walking around the house, exposing their private parts to domestic workers. Employers walking into the rooms of domestic workers during their private times at any hour of the day or night, because in many instances these domestic workers live on our premises. So employers made the excuse that this is my house or this is my property, and therefore I can walk in at any time.
And Bongiwe, you also found some of the abuse instances that sort of mirror what happens in broader society, right? For instance, you talk here about issues about employers and bosses commenting on the body features of the domestic worker.
Absolutely. So you had a lot of, sexual, hints thrown at domestic workers. They're touching their breasts, they're touching their buttocks. They're engineering for opportunities for the male boss to be home alone with the domestic worker, and then they ask for sexual favors during that time. Sometimes threatening them with losing their jobs, sometimes promising them to a little bit extra pay. And so it was very disgusting. And I think at the heart of this, if we want to understand this, these are not just acts of criminality, Thulasizwe. We need to go back and even interrogate how employers see their relationships with domestic workers. And for us, this study took us to the days of slavery, where employers felt a sense of entitlement and ownership over their workers, and almost, entitled to take from them anything that they desired
That's a strong
at any
statement. That's
point.
quite strong, yeah.
So it was, some of the issues were inexplicable in that, to that extent, and sadly, like I said, plus many of these domestic workers, do not report, the incidents because of fear of losing their jobs, and fear of secondary victimization by the police. Yeah. But what was also striking, and I think I have to mention this, what was also striking was that the male bosses tended to be the main perpetrators. But when domestic workers engaged their female bosses, the result was that they lost their job. Yeah, and they didn't lose their job only because because the female employers were necessarily did not believe them, although there were instances where they were not believed.
Right.
But they lost their jobs because clearly once that line has been crossed, the two cannot continue to coexist in the same house. So,
right. Bongiwe, before I run out of time, let's touch on your recommendations, because you've got specific recommendations that you make for the Department of Labor, for example, that have to do with policy interventions. And I know that when we're dealing with a burning fire, it seems frustrating to be talking issues of policy, that let's improve the policy. But among the things you recommend is the expansion of the inspectorate of the Department of Labor. How would that benefit, this particular situation? And also, while you're talking about that, of course, then also talk about the recommendations that include the establishment of a call center, for example.
Yes. So the recommendations touch on various issues to us. So the one you started with, we want to see a lot more by way of effective policy and regulations to support domestic workers in their environment. Because like I said, they work in isolation. It's very difficult for them to organize. So government needs to go out and find them. And so we are proposing a lot more by way of inspectorates. But we're also saying that, government needs to intervene. Domestic workers are one of those employers that do not have a job description. So that automatically makes you very vulnerable to your employer, and open to exploitation. So we want to see a lot more regulations around domestic workers, job descriptions, hours of work, but also, for those that are live-in domestic workers, what are some of the guidelines that can be provided about how employers and employees relate during the times at work or even outside of work, but when the domestic worker is still on your property? What are the rules of engagement, so to speak? We also would like to see an anonymous reporting system for domestic workers, one that will embolden them to go and report, and not fear losing their jobs. And in addition to that, we want some form of, I'm going to say a special UIF to us, for lack of a better word, but we want a kit that will allow domestic workers, to take the bold step of reporting, recognizing that they might lose their jobs, but something that will then cushion them for a few months during a transition period.
Bongiwe, thank you so much. I've got to thank you for your time. Bongiwe Ndondo from the organization Hlanganisa Institute of Development, Southern Africa. Is anyone listening? Is anyone out there listening? Tembelani Thulasingesi. What do you do when you get to the office every day? Are you listening to this? Are you hearing it? What's going to happen? I'll take you anytime if you're going to tell me exactly what you're going to do about some of these issues that we've known about them for years, but they keep getting highlighted and sort of being painted in vivid detail. But you see no movement in terms of trying to provide a fix to those problems.